All right, hello again, everyone, and welcome to part two of this lecture, which is on Us and Them by David Sedaris. So if you haven't already, make sure that you watch the other video that I posted for this week first before turning to this one, because that goes into details of what binaries are, which is important for this conversation. Also, make sure that you have read the short story Us and Them by David Sedaris before watching this. So if you haven't read the short story yet, go ahead and turn this off for now, take a look at that short story, and then return to this talk when you finish the story. So, Us and Them by David Sedaris. Again, this is on Blackboard for you under your readings. Let's go ahead and just dive right in and look at the title. So titles are an important entryway into any text, whether that is a piece of literature or otherwise. It's the first thing that we generally encounter when we're looking at a text, and it can often give us some kind of insight onto how to read whatever it is that we're taking a look at. So Us and Them, right away, we already see a binary, right? So binaries, the extremes, these either or options, us, them. So there's two things, and it's like, which side are you on? Are you with us or are you against us? Are you with like self or other, right? Are you in my group or are you an outsider, right? So us and them. So really important question that we of course have to ask then is, who is us and who is them then in this situation? And I'm going to make the argument that there are at least two different ways to read this short story and two different possible meanings for the answer to that question. So we'll get into both of those shortly here. So let's go ahead and just take a look at the first paragraph. So I'll go ahead and read part of that out loud. And notice how this is working in terms of structure and organization. It's actually following our basic essay outline and the ideas about what we've been talking about in class for what an introduction should have and what it should do. So the purpose of an introduction is, of course, to orient the reader to the topic, to offer relevant background information, and just to let us know anything that would be important for us to know before we get further into the story. So just starting from the top here. Also, by the way, as you can see, this is from a book called Dress Your Family in Corduroy and Denim by David Sedaris, which is a collection of, it's memoir. It's a collection of short stories that are true, so it's nonfiction. These are things that actually happened in his life. That's important, and that will come up later as well. So, when my family first moved to North Carolina, we lived in a rented house 3 blocks from the school where I would begin the 3rd grade. My mother made friends with one of the neighbors, but one seemed enough for her. Within a year, we would move again, and, as she explained, there wasn't much point in getting too close to people we would have to say goodbye to. Our next house was less than a mile away, and the short journey would hardly merit tears, or even goodbyes for that matter. It was more of a see you later situation. But still, I adopted my mother's attitude, as it allowed me to pretend that not making friends was a conscious choice. I could if I wanted to. It just wasn't the right time. So a lot is actually happening here, right? We learn a lot of background information in this very short first passage. So this is a young person who is living with his family, right? My family moved to North Carolina. This is someone who has just moved and made a fairly big transition from living in New York to living in North Carolina. For any of you who might have moved, especially when you were younger and switched to new schools, you probably know that that is really hard, at least for most children, right? So let's see. Then it comes out that he is in the 3rd grade. That also is really important for some things that are going to come up later. My mother made friends with one of the neighbors, but one seemed enough for her. So the mom has made one friend and one friend only, and the mom explains, we're going to be moving again soon anyway. This is a family that moves around a lot, and so she says, I don't really want to get too close to people just to have to say goodbye to them, right? And the narrator of the story, David Sedaris, his response is, and this is so subtle, you can easily miss this, right? So you have to actually pause, and if you just kind of skim over this, it's easy to miss this piece, and I think it's important. So basically the next time that they move, they don't go very far away. So basically what that means is they all could have actually made friends and kept the friends that they had. So that's kind of sadly ironic. But I still adopted my mother's attitude, as it allowed me to pretend that not making friends was a conscious choice. I could if I wanted to. It just wasn't the right time. So what is that telling us right away about this narrator? Well, one, he obviously is looking up to and admiring his mother and, seeing her as a role model and trying to be like her in certain ways. He's adopting her attitude. And so even though in certain ways it seems like they're not really paying attention to each other, this whole family throughout the story, they actually really are. Well, at least, the child is still looking up to his mother. But the next part is what's really sad to me. It allowed me to pretend that not making friends was a conscious choice. So let's take a look at that and break that passage down. So it allowed me to pretend that not making friends was a conscious choice. What does that tell us about our narrator? He doesn't have any friends, right? So what I see right away from this first glimpse of this character sketch that is drawn for us here is a third grader who is really putting on a brave face. He's trying to act very tough, right? He's trying to be like, it's fine. Who needs friends? It's not the right time. It's just not the right time for me to have friends. Which I think is pretty sad to think about a third grader just saying, it's not a good time for me to have friends right now, right? So obviously this character does not have any friends, and he's trying to put on a mask, right? He's trying to put on a face saying, like, I could have friends if I wanted to, but I just don't want to. It's just not a good time for me. When the reality of the situation is, even if he wanted to, he's not very good at making friends. And there's not really a reason given. Maybe he's shy. A lot of it likely has to do with the fact that he's been uprooted and moved around so much, and it's just not easy to be the new kid in school. Okay, so kind of going on from there, he talks about living in New York State and how things are different there than they are here. But then it's the next part that becomes really important here. So their neighbors, the Tomkeys, are really notably different from everybody else who lives in there in an important way. And that is that they do not own a television. Mr. Tomkey has said that he does not believe in television, which David's family notices is different than saying, I don't like television, right? There's a difference between saying I just don't like television versus I don't believe in it, right? What does it mean to not believe in television? So what does the narrator do? Well, he gets very intrigued by the Tomkeys, and he gets very curious about, well, what do they do? If they don't watch television, then how do they spend their time, right? How do they actually communicate with each other? How do they know what time to eat dinner? Like, the TV just tells us all of these things about life that are important for us to know. So he starts actually spying on his neighbors. He's standing in the bushes, he's staring in their windows, and that's where I think it's really important that we learned right away that this particular character is in third grade, because I think that I know at least my impression would be very, very different from a third grader to if this character were, like, I don't know, in like his late 20s or whatever, right? Something like that. I feel like, this is a lot more innocent, right? This is just a child who's very curious versus, okay, this is like really weird and creepy, right? So this is a child, and yes, it might be a little bit weird and it might be a little bit creepy, but for the most part, he just wants to know, right? He's just a kid, and he's just trying to better understand the world, and he's, he thinks it's very bizarre for someone to not watch television because his family, as you can see in the story, watches a lot of television to the point that it's kind of insinuated that they're not really listening to each other or communicating with each other very much. It's more the television is almost like a substitute for human connection for them. But I think that is one important way to look at who is us and who is them in the story, right? There's one way to look at this dichotomy of us and them to see us is everybody who watches television, and them is the Tomkeys, the ones who don't watch television. I think that's the most obvious surface level way of reading this short story, because I think that, the narrator places a lot of weight on watching television, and I think that makes a lot of sense given the fact that this is someone who, his life is very unstable. He's bounced around a lot, and America is a big country, right? But what does America have in common? Television programs. right? So no matter where this child is living, whether he's on the East Coast, the West Coast, the Midwest, whatever, wherever he is put into a new school, he'll at least have that in common with the other students. He'll at least be able to say, hey, did you see this on whatever, TV program last night, or like, this character from this movie. That's something he can relate to other people about. Even if he doesn't know people in real life, he still at least knows the names of celebrities, the names of characters from, cartoons or whatever. And I think that it provides him some kind of stability, and it has kind of a grounding effect for him. And it's just one way for him to navigate the world, which has been very destabilized for him. So again, that's one way to look at who is us and who is them. Us, everybody who watches television; them, this one weird family, the Tomkeys, who do not. And that's kind of like the overt plot that everything is kind of centering around, right? Is the fact that this character is spying on the Tomkeys, wondering what on earth does a family do if they don't watch television. And what he found is that they actually, they hang out with each other. And he's very mystified at one point because he sees Mr. Tomkey, banging on the table and, gesticulating with his fork at the dinner table. And our narrator here, he's just very mystified by this. And he wonders, who is Mr. Tomkey copying? If he doesn't watch television, then who could he possibly be imitating? And I found that to be a pretty illuminating and a pretty telling passage in this narrative, because basically it shows something about the way that the narrator sees the world. He doesn't really think about the fact that someone could just be very genuine, right? Or just very original. Originality just doesn't even seem possible to him, because to him it's like I think one of the teachers, was it the math teacher, was mimicking a cartoon character, and he was thinking about how, the Tomkeys completely don't understand that reference because they don't watch TV, and so look at what they're missing out on, right? So to him it's like everything is kind of this a room full of mirrors, or a copy of a copy of a copy. I think about this idea of reality television, which is so interesting. It seems like an oxymoron, right? Television is obviously not reality, and yet this idea of reality television, it's this kind of idea of being in a room full of mirrors, where reality television, we're supposed to believe that this is reality, when it's obviously very scripted and very much not just normal reality. Reality TV shows, the reality TV show stars, were supposed to think they're just like us, right? And so the reality TV shows are trying to pretend, they're trying to look like just everyday reality. And also we see people in everyday reality trying to mimic and look like and act like, and kind of taking their cues from these reality TV shows. So it's kind of interesting because it's a mirror, right? A mirror of a mirror, or a copy of a copy of a copy. What happens if you take a document and then you put it in a copy machine, and then if you then take the copy that you make and copy that instead of copying the original, and how it just gets kind of warped and faded. The more times you do that, that's kind of at least what came up to my mind as I'm reading this story, about how everyone is not original. They're just copying something that they saw on television, except for the Tomkeys. They're the only characters who actually, they don't have television as a reference, and they're just kind of living their lives. And this is mystifying to our main character. And you can see him kind of going off into these weird delusional fantasies where he takes everything and he makes it super extreme in his head, and he kind of imagines himself as being the Tomkeys protector or something like that, even though they don't actually have very much contact at all in real life. But he builds this whole fantastical narrative in his head about how they're so close and how he does this for them, and he really sees himself as their savior or their benefactor, right? Until he becomes very, very angry with them. So why does that happen? Well, let's go ahead and look at that passage. So, the Tomkeys are not around on Halloween. On Halloween, everybody dresses up, all of the kids go out, they go trick-or-treating, and they earn candy, right, from doing that. But the Tomkeys are out on a boat, and so they are actually gone for October 31st, and then they come knocking door to door asking for candy on November 1st. And as the narrator so eloquently puts it, everybody knows that to basically go door to door and ask for candy on Halloween is called trick-or-treating, but to do it the night after is called begging, right? So he is very irritated. He is frustrated. In fact, he's irate that they would dare to come to his house and try to take his candy. He thinks that this is just unbearably rude. And he even makes the point that there are just some things that even TV can't teach you, right? This is just something you should know. So he's been making these excuses for them about other things, like, oh, they don't watch TV, like the fact that they eat dinner later than most people. Like, it's probably because they don't have the television, so they just don't know what time they're supposed to eat at. But he says even without watching television, you just should know when Halloween is, and you should not come asking for candy the day after. It's just awkward and rude, right? So the narrator's mother at this point, we have already seen some glimpses of her, and so this is right in character with everything that we know about her. She's someone who really, social graces is an important thing to her. She tries to really not like stir the pot, make waves, that kind of thing. She just agrees with what everybody says, even if she doesn't actually agree with it, just to try to like, just keep things going smoothly. So basically, when the Tomkeys come over and the children are trick-or-treating, she just tries to smooth it over, and she says, kids, go get the candy. And what she's saying is, just bring me some of your candy so that I can give it to them and get these guys out of here, right? She's not necessarily amused by it either. She's not necessarily happy about it. She probably thinks it's kind of weird herself, but she just wants to basically move along. Well, our narrator is really displeased about this. He's, again, like I said, he's irate, and it kind of breaks the bond that he had seen himself having with the Tomkey family that, of course, again, was all in his head. So he goes to his room to get the candy, and he starts dividing it right away into different piles, depending on what value it has. So he takes the name brand stuff, and he's like, they're definitely not getting this. This is my tier 1 candy. They can't have it. And then, maybe they can get like the gross kind that, nobody likes that kind anyway. But then there's like this level of candy that it's good candy, but it's not good for him. Because something that's important to know about our narrator is that he's extremely allergic to chocolate. So that's a really important point here. So basically, he's taking too long to get the candy, and his mom starts coming. And he can hear her coming down the hallway. He hears her footsteps, and he's like panicking. Right? And so he says, if I would have been thinking logically, I would have like stashed it somewhere. But he wasn't thinking logically. He was panicking. So he just starts unwrapping the candy and just shoving it in his mouth as much as he can. So he's covered in chocolate, and there's just candy wrappers everywhere when his mother walks in. And let me actually read this part out loud here. All right. So when the mother walks in, she takes one look at him. What the hell are you doing? She whispered, but my mouth was too full to answer. I'll be just a moment, she called. You can kind of already hear that like fake voice to them as she's furious with her child right now. And as she closed the door behind her and moved toward my bed, I began breaking the wax lips and candy necklaces pulled from pile number 2. These were the second best things I had received, and while it hurt to destroy them, it would have hurt even more to give them away. So basically, he is eating things that are not even good for him just because he doesn't want the Tomkeys to have it. So his mom is snatching up candy. Not those, I pleaded, but rather than words, my mouth expelled chocolate, chewed chocolate, which fell into the sleeve of her sweater. Not those, not those. So you can see him, he's just covered in chocolate, and he's just begging her to not take any of his candy away. She shook her arm, and the mound of chocolate dropped like a horrible turd upon my bedspread. You should look at yourself, she said. I mean, really, really look at yourself. And I think that word look at yourself is really important here because of all of the different connotations of that word look, like just to visually see something, but also thinking about like blind seers, which are kind of like a trope in literature, right? To look in a metaphorical sense as well. So to self-examine, to self-reflect, to investigate just what, to reflect upon one's life and one's choices, those kinds of things, right? So he stays in his room that night for a while, and then he comes downstairs, and his family is watching television. So he joins them. He asks a question, and everyone just tells him, shh, they just want him to be quiet because they just want to watch television, which is the complete opposite of the Tomkeys family, where there is no television and everyone is talking to each other, right? And so he goes on to watch the news and to watch whatever goes on after the news. And that's where the story ends. But two last things that I want to pick up here. One is the other interpretation that we can see in Who Is Us and Who Is Them. So again, going back to the beginning and just seeing how this character is just really lonely, right? Someone who doesn't have any friends, and just how North Carolina is a difficult place for them to fit into because they're not from the South and they're being tested with okra, right? The neighbor tests the mother with, will you eat this okra, that kind of thing. And so, I think another way of looking at Who Is Us and Who Is Them in the story is to think about actually the narrator and his family as them. So on the other side of that divide of Who Is Us and Who Is Them, right? So in one way, the narrator falls into the us category because he watches television and therefore he's normal, right? And the Tomkeys, they're weird and they don't watch television. But another way of looking at it is to see the narrator and his family actually as the outcasts, because they're not from around there. They moved to a small community, and they're the ones who are actually the outsiders, right? They don't have a Southern accent. They don't eat okra, right? They're not familiar with all of the people who have always known each other there for their whole lives. So they're kind of the newcomers coming in, and they're actually them, right? So another way of looking at this is to see past this child's kind of bravado and his tough face, and to see actually kind of the pain and the loneliness that's lying beneath that. The last thing I want to end this conversation with is, I'm really curious if you all have hope for this narrator, or what you think about him as a person, not as a person frozen in time as this child, but as the human being who is sitting down reflecting on this event and writing about it. I think it's really interesting that his mother says, you should look at yourself, just really look at yourself. And that's actually exactly what he's doing here, right? He's writing it down. He's telling this story. He's writing the memoir of this particular thing that happened. And the act of doing that, I think, shows a lot of self-awareness, because for most of us, if we were going to think about what story would I like to tell about my life, I think we would probably choose a story where we look good, right? The time I won the blue ribbon, the time that I, did this nice thing for a stranger, that kind of story, right? A story where we look good. But instead, he's actually seeking out and choosing to tell a story where he doesn't look good, which I think actually takes a tremendous amount of courage to do something like that. And also, again, it just shows that he's reflecting. And only when we reflect will we grow, right? If we just want to ignore all of the things that we ever did that are kind of embarrassing and we don't want to bring those to the light, I have less faith in someone's ability to grow when they're doing that kind of thing. So I just want to end by saying that, yes, it does seem like this narrator, he might come off as kind of maybe a brat, right? Kind of like a not a super great person. But just remember, this is just one moment of his entire life, right? And I think that just the fact that he's willing to share this less than glamorous moment, to me, gives me a lot of faith in his ability to kind of learn and grow from that, right? This moment that's less than shining, this moment of a childhood failing, right? A moment of that if he didn't tell the story, no one would probably ever know about it, right? He could easily cover it up. He doesn't have to share the story, but he's choosing to. He's choosing to have that kind of transparency and to bring up and say, hey, actually, instead of showing you like this time where I looked like a hero, let's take a look at me when I was just being super selfish, and I was, actually making myself sick, devouring candy just because I didn't want somebody else to have it, which I think also, he might not just be talking about himself here, but perhaps about something about the larger human condition, perhaps overall, because he's probably not the only child who has done something like this. Maybe not in this exact way, but maybe even as a child, you might have done something similar, broken a crayon because you didn't want your sibling to have it, or who knows, that kind of thing. So hopefully this talk was helpful for you, and remember that you do need to post on the discussion board this week about this story for credit. So you need to do two things. One is to make a post, and then the other is to respond to somebody else's post. So I have some questions written in the discussion board just to get you started. You can just respond to anything that really stood out to you. That might be something from the story, that might be something from this talk that I just gave about the story, or it could could be kind of generated from the discussion questions. But anyway, I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Also, something that I haven't addressed in this talk now is humor, right? This is a kind of, David Sedaris is known, he's a contemporary American writer, and he's known for humor, and he's known for memoir. So I'm curious how the humor was working for you, if you thought it was funny, that kind of thing. But it's very open, so just whatever stands out to you, I look forward to reading those reflections. Have a great rest of your week, and I think that's all for now. So thank you again, and I look forward to reading your comments.